Good morning and hello. This is once again Scott Johnson, aka Dad on Rails, and I am driving in the wee hours, and I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite aspects of Rails. It's consistent directory structure. When you make a Rails app, and I apologize for being partially in the dark, it is the wee hours. I don't want to drive with lights on. When you make an application in Rails, it builds a directory that represents your application, and in that directory are a whole bunch of different subdirectories. Okay? And every Rails app basically has the same directory structure. And what I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to speak from memory, since I don't have any notes in front of me, as to what that directory structure is and where to look for stuff. Okay? And once you understand this, you'll be able to maintain almost any Rails app of no matter what it does, it will look the same way. Okay. All right. Okay. So your Rails app basically is divided into what I would refer to as two parts, even though it's actually more than two subdirectories. The first subdirectory is app. And app represents the functional code that makes up your application. Okay? And within app, there's a whole bunch of directories, but there are a handful that really matter. So the first one that matters is app/assets. And underneath assets are a whole bunch of subdirectories, one for style sheets, one for images, one for JavaScripts, etc. So what this means, for example, is if you want to put an image in your Rails app, you would copy it into app/assets/images. Whether it's a PNG, a JPEG, or a GIF, it's going to go in app/assets/images. Now the next directory within there that you're going to pay attention to is style sheets. Okay? And this is where style sheets are located. Now, when you build your application, there is one style sheet. I'm just going to figure out where I'm going to. 64 West. Okay. There's one main style sheet that's usually generated, which is usually called application.css or application.css.scss. And if I got that wrong, it's because I'm not a CSS expert. But there's basically one main style sheet, and there are style sheets that are typically generated per controller that you build. Okay, and you can put your style sheet changes in either place depending on how you want their locality of styles to exist. Okay, so app/assets/images, app/assets/style sheets. And then the next is app/assets/JavaScripts. And this I am the least expert in because I am not a JavaScript person. JavaScript is fundamentally useful, it's very powerful, and it is a skill that I have not yet mastered. I try bit by bit, but I am still at best a neophyte, perhaps, a modest novice. Okay. So we talked about app/assets. Now the next directory structure that you care about is app/controllers. When you create a controller with Rails new G controller, it will be generated into the controllers directory. Okay? And to reiterate from our RESTful discussion yesterday, a controller is the thing that receives a web request, and it is where you define your RESTful actions. Okay? So when you put a def index or a def new or a def create, it goes inside a controller, and those controllers will exist inside app/controllers. Okay? app/models. Now this, dear listener, is where the bulk of your application should live, because if you remember from yesterday, we talked about thin controller, fat model, okay? And what this means is the bulk of your application is defined as business logic. And wow, I am looking at my video screen and I am a completely black head. I am completely dark. Let's see if I can toss on a little bit of light here. Maybe there. All right, so now you at least have something. You can at least see I'm not a spooky disembodied head. I apologize for that. Hopefully the sun crests soon. All right, so now your model directory is going to have a series of files that are generated for every time you create a database model. So when you do a Rails G model space user or Rails G model space product, okay, it will create an application. It will create a file in app/models. We'll also create a bunch of other files, but we'll talk about those later. And that file represents how Rails talks to the database for this particular thing. At the very top of the file, it will say class, product, angle, application record. Okay? And what that means is this is a product class that inherits from application record, which means it knows how to talk to the database. Now, in app models, you can have really almost anything. And I have historically placed what are called PORO, plain old Ruby objects, in that directory, as well as things that inherit from application record. And I have other Rails friends that look at me aghast and say, Scott, that's horrible. Your PORO objects belong in a different place. Rails itself does not care, okay? And it depends whether you define a model as something that talks to the database, or if you define a model as just a plain old Ruby class, whether it talks to the database or not. Both answers are valid. It is up to you. Okay. So we talked about app/assets, app/controllers, app/models, and the next up, app/views. Okay. Now, a view file in Rails is an HTML template, and that view file defines how your application actually looks. Okay? Now, within app/views, there is a subdirectory created for every controller that you have. So if you have a user's controller, there will be a user's sets of views. This brings us up to one basic thing, just to give people a heads up. Models are singular, okay, because a model represents one instance of data inside the database. Basically, think of it as a model is one row within a table. A controller is plural because it represents things that can be a collection. Okay. Similarly, views are usually named pluralized unless your controller is singular. Okay. And when a controller is singular versus plural is sort of an advanced REST topic, and even I do this stuff all the time. Even I don't always get that one quite right. All right, I have just about seen my highway. Okay. All right. So basically, when you create a controller will be generated inside the app/controllers. A view directory will be created inside app/views, and inside that app/views/whatever, right? If it's a user's controller, it'll be a user's directory. You would then have a series of views, not just one, but a series. Generally speaking, one for each RESTful action. Okay, so there would be an index, usually .html.erb, for the index view, a new .html.erb, and so on. Now, within your view directory, you will also often find files that begin with an underscore, right? That little flat character. And an underscore is there to indicate that this file is special. It is set apart, and it is what is called a partial. And partials are one of my absolute favorite things in Rails. Partials make me happy. And the reason is that partials allow for that software engineer holy grail, which is referred to as reusability. Okay, so there is a command in Rails called Rails GScaffold. And this has been in Rails since the dawn of time. And I, because I'm an idiot, have only recently discovered the Zen that is Rails GScaffold. And when I say Zen, I mean it is a Zen thing. It is awesome. Okay. So, let's change lanes safely. 65 north, Indy. All right. When you do a Rails GScaffold users, or actually let's do Rails GScaffold products. Okay. When you do this, what you get is, actually, I think it's a trinity, because so many good things in the world are trinities. You get a controller, you get a model, you get views. It is absolutely a trinity, and you get helpers, and that makes it kind of a quad, but we're going to ignore that because trinity. Okay, right? Because not only is a trinity a good thing, right, it's also a really kick-ass cool character in the Matrix. I love the Matrix. Anyway, now the reason why I reference this is when you do a Rails GScaffold products, you're going to get, depending on how your application is set, how your Rails application is set up, you might get a whole series of view files. And in those view files will be a file called underscore form.html.erb. Remember I said if it starts with an underscore, it's a partial. And underscore form.html.erb are all the characters, is all the stuff you need to make a reusable web form to handle a new action or an edit action. Okay? And so when you look at new.html.erb, you will see it will have a command, $=, render, space, and it will say, depending on the variant of Rails, partial : form, and form being in quotes, %angle, or it might say render : form. Okay? And there'll be one of these that says new.html.erb, and one of those that'll be say edit. And the reason that you have this, if you think about when you create an object on the web in a web form, those form fields are the same whether it is a new object or it is an object that you are editing. And that partial allows you to only write those fields once. And this is phenomenal. Alright, so we're going to set some cruise control now. Alright, I am settled in. I have an hour and 58 minutes. Let's continue with this video. Alright. So, app is where the bulk of the code for your application lives. Assets are images, JavaScripts, and style sheets. Controllers are the RESTful interfaces that talk to the outside world. Models are the things that talk to the database and or plain old Ruby objects. Okay. And views are the HTML layout. Now, within views, there are going to be a couple of special folders that you're going to say, I don't have a controller called layouts. Okay. And so in app/views, there will be a directory, and I believe it is called layouts, although I could be slightly wrong about this. And this is where you'll find a file called application.html.erb. And the way to think of this is a master template, okay? And I could be wrong about the directory, the file name of the folder, but if you search your project for application.html.erb, you will find this file. And this file is the very first thing rendered in your Rails app, and it will put out the angle HTML, angle head, ... angle body. Then there will be a command inside there called angle % = yield %angle. And you'll say to yourself, what the heck is this thing? I don't know what yield does. Well, the way to understand this is when a request comes in from the web, what Rails does is Rails opens the file application.html.erb, and it puts out the stuff that's there, and then it literally yields the flow of control to whatever your controller is, and inserts that HTML crap that was just generated, and then it resumes and puts out the footer stuff. Okay, it literally is yielding control. Okay. I have a special treat for myself for this ride. I have a can of Diet Dr. Unobtainium, aka Dr. Pepper Vanilla Cream Soda. Or Dr. Pepper Cream Soda, I guess is the way to say it. Oh, the sweet nectar of the gods. Okay. You will also usually, most Rails apps find another directory in here, inside views. This is user created generally, and it is usually referred to as shared. Shared is where you would put things, HTML, bits of HTML scraps that you want to reuse across different aspects of your project. Okay? One example might be a footer. Another example might be some kind of common template. But these things actually exist. Okay? All right. And I said it was a trinity, and then I said, oh no, it's a quad. And the missing thing that you commonly use is you commonly have a directory you have a directory in all Rails application called helpers. And helpers are unbelievably useful until they bite you in the ass, and then you will go, oh good heavens, why are they like this? And I'm going to give you the warning up ahead, a warning in advance. All right, let's talk about what a helper is. A helper is a series of methods, okay, that are used to run code easily inside a view that you want to use regularly, okay? So let's say, for example, you want to display, you have an object, okay? So you've got a product object, okay? And that product object is going to have an attribute called created at, which is the date that the product was created. And let's say for your application, you care about dates as represented by year, month, day, okay? In other words, YYY-MM-DD, okay? So you would have a method that says def display underscore product underscore created. Takes parentheses, and it takes a product, okay, and it says prod. Okay, and what that method's going to do is it's going to return product dot date dot created at parentheses, and then a formatting string that represents how that date is, okay? And the value for this is you just call this method as def product, as you just call it as angle % = product underscore created at parentheses product, okay? And then close parentheses and % angle. and you just call this whatever you want in your template to display the date a product was created. Okay. Now, this is all well and good. And I said views are useful, and they are. But there are two things to know about views. The first thing to know is that Rails will, by default, generate a view file for every controller. And you think, my God, this is magical. I have a view file for my products controller and a view file for my users controller. And I can keep my routines for my user's view isolated from my routines for my product view. Yes, you can. And you think, and my God, this is great. And then you say, you know, I want to display the views for my user dates differently from the views for my product dates. But I'm going to have one routine, def obj, right? Generic for object, underscore created at. And I'm gonna have one of these. I'm gonna put it inside my user views, and my products views. And the right one will get called, etc. It all will be good. And then you will try this, and you will discover that you get the wrong date formatting for a different object, and you'll be like, what the hell? And this brings us to the concept of the namespace. In computer programming, a namespace represents the class, not an object-oriented class, but the class of all the names that are available to you. Helpers in Rails have a single global namespace. What this means is that the way Rails works internally, when it compiles up all of your helpers into one, there is only one namespace for helpers. Okay? And this means that all of your helpers end up in the same file, and whichever one is called in your obj underscore created at is the one that happened to be compiled either first or last. And even I can't tell you which one it is. I think it's first. So it's probably executed from top down. So the moral of the story here. Helpers are really, really useful because they make it easy to write code that you can call at runtime in a view. Okay? But there's one global namespace for helpers, so do not have the same method name in different view files. And this is why I simply put all of my view helpers in a single file, because it helps me remember that these things are not different. They are not, the fact there are different files that are used is simply a convention for organizing. I have a view helper on a big application that looks like this large, except it might be several hundred, if not a few thousand lines. Helpers are just that useful. Okay. All right. App. Assets. App controllers. App models. App views. App helpers. Those are the things you will most use in your application. Okay? The vast bulk of your application code, when I say that, I mean 80%, 90% will exist in one of those assets, controllers, models, views, helpers. One of those 5 places. That is where your application will, by and large, exist. Okay? And so when you are thinking about where code goes, just think about which of those directories. Now, I have said that that's where your code goes, but there are other directories in Rails. All right, and we are going to now talk about some of them. All right, so there is a directory in Rails called config. Okay, and within config, there are a variety of subdirectories, one of which is called initializers. Now, config is where configuration information goes. Now, These are usually files that end in .rb because they're mostly actual Ruby files, and if they're not ending in RB, they tend to end in YML or YAML. Okay? YAML is short for yet another markup language. Okay? And yes, I'm smiling because I like the pun there. It's yet another markup language. All right. So now I'm going to talk about config initializers, because this is the first place that I really ran into problems with Rails, and it was because I didn't understand the nature of the Rails loading order. When you start up a Rails application, and this can be done actually in different ways. It can be done either by running bundle exec Rails S, okay, and that starts a Rails web server. Or it can be done by doing bundle exec Rails C, which starts the Rails console. Or it can be done by running a rake task. In other words, bundle exec rake and then the name of the rake task. Okay? Each of these things instantiates the entire Rails application from scratch. Okay? As does running Sidekick or many of the other app things you can do. Now, oh Lord, Diet Dr. Unobtainium, that is good. I want my current favorite soda. When you start your Rails application, one of the very first thing that happens in the initialization order, and Rails is an application and it is very, very specific about how it runs, is the first thing that happens is the files located in config/initializers are executed. And they're executed in succession, and I believe it is alphabetical. If you have a.rb in config/initializers, it will be loaded near the top. Now, let's say that you want to have something, you want to define some, let's say that you want to have some constant values that are defined, that are always accessible anywhere in your Rails application. I do this all the time because when I started doing Rails, my buddy at the time, Jared, it was either Jared or Wolfram, I can't remember which one, said, you put a file in your Rails application called constants.rb, and inside constants.rb, you have things that you want to be constant. And a constant in Ruby, as in many other languages, is defined as all uppercase. Okay? So let's say you want a constant always available to you, and the constant's name is pi, Pi, and it's got a value of 3.14159. So you create a file called constants.rb, you locate it inside config/initializers, and all you put in that file is pi equals 3.14159. Okay? You save that file, and then you go into your Rails application root, okay, which is not app, but the baseline directory that was created after you did a Rails G, or actually a Rails new, and you start your application. You say bundle exec Rails C. What Rails will do is it will load all of the application into memory, and it will instantiate the Rails console. And we haven't talked about the Rails console yet, and the magical Zen moment that is the Rails console. And if you were to type into the console PI, you would get back the value 3.14159. And this is good. Now you would type exit and leave the console. You would open up that file constants.rb, and you would make the constant 3.14159a. Little-case a, big A, doesn't matter. Save it, open up, do a bundle exec Rails C, and you are going to find an error is going to occur on your screen. And the reason for that error is that when Rails starts up, the first thing it does is it executes all of the code in config/initializers, because they are initializers. They happen first. And because that code happens to be, that code now has a bug, because 3.14159A is not a valid floating point number, it will shut down the application, and it will shut it down hard. And when I first started doing Rails, I did not realize this or understand just how important the crap that goes in config/initializers was. So, a little bit of a life lesson. All right. Config is where the different things that go into the Rails application, define the configuration of the Rails application. Other important files in here is, there's a bunch, and I'm going to come back to them in another podcast, because I actually do need to have a list of files in front of me to talk accurately. Okay. So, app and stuff for your code. Config is at the same level as app, and that has configuration information. The next important top-level directory is DB, and then within DB is a directory called migrations. Okay. And this is where database migrations live. And a database migration is a text file with an RB extension that defines the structure of your database in terms of a change routine. And I'm going to come back to that in a whole separate podcast, because migrations are, oh God, they're important. Okay. But just know that when you have a change to your database, it is represented in a file that is located in db/migrations. Okay. App config db. Another important file in db is called schema.rb, and this is a Ruby language version of what your database's entire structure is. If you want to know where a column called foo is located in your database, you look in db/schema.rb, and it will be there. Okay? All right, so now, other things. And there are other directory structures. And the next one we're going to talk about is lib. And in specific, lib/tasks and lib/tasks/data. All right. You have heard me reference before the concept of a rake task. A rake task is a way to build a routine that is executed via the command line to do something that manipulates the state of your application. Okay? And this seems utterly, when you start Rails, when you start doing Rails stuff, you're like, but I'm building a web application. Why do I need a command line? That's just silly. Well, dear listener, it is not silly. Command lines in internet development are unbelievably useful because they are repeatable. And they let you write commands or sequences of things to do that you will need over and over and over again. And rake is a technology in Rails that was written by the late Jim Wyrick. Jim passed away about 5 years ago. And Jim was one of the bright lights within the Ruby community. Brilliant software engineer. And Jim, and if you want to learn some awesome computer science, search, I believe it's YouTube, for Jim Wyrick and watch his set of videos on how to write a version control system from scratch, and you will learn more and better computer science there than you will ever learn from me. Jim was smart. I miss Jim. I did not know him personally, I only knew of him, but he was smart. Okay then. Within lib/tasks, you will place one or more files. There won't be any there by default. And the way I organize those files is I organize them usually by singular names that correspond to the class name I am manipulating. And then I will place other ones in there that are functional and represent different things. Now, I am going to talk for a minute about how I use Rake, and I'm going to give an example. When I build a web application, one of the things that I find makes it very useful for other people on the team, or for just myself, is I seed my application with a bunch of data that represents the initial state of the application. Okay? So, if you think about an application, most stuff on the web has users. So I have a class on I have a user class, and then my user.rake task. It's all named user.rake. At the top, I have task. I have names, and a rake task is written this way: namespace space :user do end. And then within that, there's a series of tasks, and I indent 2 characters, because 2 characters is the one true way to indent. I'm sorry. Task space : init, scooch, so angle, or =angle, environment, do, blank line, end. And what that's saying is the top of the rake task is a namespace. The top of the rake file is a namespace. It's called user. And then there's a task called init, and it references environment. It says, give me all my good Railsy goodness. Give me all my classes and my methods, my database connection, and so on. And almost invariably, you will want your rake tasks to use environment until that magical moment when you realize you don't, and then you have an epiphany. And then within my init task, I would have the routines that go and create a series of users. Now, if you are a Rails denizen, and you've been doing this a while, you're like, but Scott, there's seeds.yaml, and that's the way you seed data. And I say thee nay. I have used seeds.yaml, and this is the canonical Rails way that you seed, and this is a case where I differ from the Rails core team, because I believe that user data is really, really important, and I believe that I am going to want to have conditional logic to make decisions about my seeding process. And with seeds.yaml, unless I misunderstand it, and that's a possibility because I've used a lot of different versions of Rails, and it's possible that seeds.yaml has been improved, it does not allow for that. And when I seed data, what I am striving for is a concept called idempotence. IDEMPOTENCE. And idempotence is a fancy computer science term, and what it actually means is I can execute the same routine again and again and again, and it will not have side effects. If I have a user named fuzzygroup@gmail.com, and yes, that's my email address, feel free to drop me an email and tell me what you want to learn. Okay? I believe that user should be able to be executed once or n times. If the user already exists, it should just magically skip over and or update it with new attributes. Okay, so I said when I define a rake task, I usually have one rake task per class in my application, or per class in my application. And this usually represents one database model. And then I have a series of other ones that are functional. So I have one, in this case, in this context, called seed.rake, and seed.rake invokes all of my other data seeding routines, one per class, and so on. Okay? Now, I referenced in one of my earlier podcasts a site called covidnearme.org. COVID Near Me is a website that I run, and it's about the current COVID pandemic. And what COVID Near Me does is it builds a bunch of analytical information. And the other day, we had the need to write a diagnostic tool. So I created a file called tools.rake. And what tools.rake does is it takes a file on the command line, so it takes an environment variable, and it analyzes it and compiles down a bunch of data. And the reason why I did this was because we were having a bunch of problems debugging our application. Hi, Elaine. Elaine is the other person that I work on COVID Near Me with. And we needed a utility. And it was easy to use Rake to write a command line utility to compile the data out of this. Now, the reason we needed this is because normally our load process is like this. It's like this big. And I needed a simple way to verify that the data that we were getting out of Johns Hopkins, which has been a good partner on this project, in the sense that they're an unofficial partner, because we just use their crap. They don't even know we exist. But it wasn't always reliable. So we wrote a tool, and we looked at our data, and we sorted the problem out. Okay. And Rake, and the nice thing about Rake is a Rake task is an instantiation of your Rails application. And as an instantiation of your Rails application, it has access to all of the classes, models, and methods in your application. And this is phenomenal. Until, and yes, there is always an until. This is computer science, and what the computer giveth, the computer taketh away. You have a syntax error in your Rake application, in your Rake file. Okay? And this doesn't bother you in development. But then you deploy. And what will happen when you deploy is your Rails application runs in a different way in the deployment world. In the deployment world, your Rails application has to be absolutely perfect. It cannot have any syntax errors in your Rake tasks, because that will shut your deployed Rails application down. And now I'm going to tell you a trick. Okay? Now, if you are a good Rails person, you say, but Scott, there's test coverage. Test coverage will save us. Actually, test coverage will not save you. Jim Wyrick was brilliant, but test coverage for Rake tasks is hard to write, and I have never managed to really write test coverage well for Rake tasks. So if I leave a syntax error in a Rake task and I deploy my Rails application, that Rails application will not start up, because Rails will parse my Rake application as part of the startup process, because all the code is compiled into one giant furball, and it will blow up. And given that it's hard to write test coverage for Rake tasks, that's not going to save you. Here, and then the next thing you'll say is, but use a linter. Use a CI/CD system. These are all good ideas. Linters are a pain in the ass to run, and I've yet to find one I actually like. Here is the cheap trick. All right. What you do is, before you deploy, you start your Rails application locally in production mode. So what you do is you go into your Rails web root. Okay, so that's the root of the application, and you say Rails_env equal production space bundle exec Rails S, and you start up. And what that Rails_env equals production is that's an environment variable, and that tells Rails start up, but start in production mode. And then it starts up in production mode, and it will automatically syntax check your entire application for you as a side effect of being in production mode. Because Rails in development mode is designed to be forgiving. It's designed to take you and wrap you in an embrace, give you a great big hug, and love the hell out of you. Because in development mode, syntax errors are perfectly okay. In production mode, they are horrible. Okay. We are 45 minutes in, and this has been a lecture on the Rails directory structure. All right, let's talk about a couple other things. lib/task/data. When you have static data that is useful in your application, for example, a bunch of CSV files that seed your application, I place those in lib/task/data. I have been doing this so long, I no longer know whether or not this is a Rails thing or a Scott thing. I cannot tell. Either way, it's a good place to put them. Now, the next top-level directory, and we're almost done, people, I promise, is where the tests that define your application go. Okay? And this brings us to the topic of test-driven development, which is actually one of my favorite topics. I'm a huge believer in testing, and they either go in tests and then subdirectories for each functional thing, i.e. tests/controllers, tests/views, tests/models, tests/helpers, or they go in spec/views, spec/controllers, spec/models, spec/helpers, and so on. Tests, or test, I can't remember if it's plural or singular. It is only 6:20 in the morning. I apologize for that. It's either tests or test. Can't remember. Or it's spec. There are different ways you write tests in the Rails world. There is what's basically called test unit, aka mini test, or there is RSpec. RSpec, these are different standards and different ways you write tests. I love the syntax of RSpec because it is more expressive. However, RSpec is slow, and when you write tests, that you are writing something that's going to run every time you do a deploy, every time you do a check on your application, and so on. So tests that run fast are a godsend, okay? So while I traditionally have written RSpec, and I've written hundreds of thousands of lines of RSpec, yes, I'm that guy, I have, as of recent days, reverted to test because it is just simply faster. All right, so we're going to sum up now. You generate a new Rails application. The bulk of your code is going to go into app/assets, app/controllers, app/models, app/views, app/helpers. That's where the bulk of your code goes. There's a directory called config, and that is where anything that configures your application goes. And in initializers are things that you want to happen on load. Okay, they literally initialize your application. Syntax errors there will shut down everything. Never ever make a change to initializers and then do a deploy without restarting your Rails web server. Okay, even if it's just development mode, always do this before you do a deploy. Otherwise, that a syntax error in config initializers will shut down your whole web application, your whole production Rails application. And then you'll be doing run in circles, scream and shout. Not that I've ever made this mistake. Okay. DB is where stuff related to your database goes. Two things there are schema.rb and then a subdirectory called migrations. Lib/tasks and lib/tasks/data. Okay. And then either test or spec. Okay, other things that I forgot to mention. In config, there's a file called routes. This is where you place the changes to your application's routes. I will come back to routes at a point when I have figured it out a little bit better than I do. Right now, I kind of pedal to the metal, hard nose that sucker. All right, and that is an overview of the Rails directory structure. I love the Rails directory structure because it's consistent and because I can parachute into any Rails application no matter what it is, and this will tell me how my application works. Thank you so much for listening. Take care now.